Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the next in our webinar series on the new local government housing initiatives. Today, you're joining us for the small-scale multi-unit housing webinar, specifically on secondary suites and accessory dwellings. I'm very pleased to be joining you from the territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt Nation and Songhees Nation. And I encourage you to reflect on the territories that you are joining this conversation from. We have a panel of experts to present information and respond to your questions. I'm going to start by introducing our panel. We have Avery Kelly, who's a director in the Planning and Land Use Management branch. Avery leads the small-scale multi-unit housing initiative. We also have Matthew Smith, who is a senior policy analyst who's also working on small-scale multi-unit housing, sometimes referred to as SMA. And Matthew is also with the Planning and Land Use Management branch. And we have Leslie Kramer, a senior policy analyst with the Housing Policy branch, who has been working on the Secondary Suites Initiative program and who's available to answer questions on that. And I am a director also within the Planning and Land Use Management branch, and really pleased to see so many people join today. We do have a lot of people on the call right now. We're over 300, and I expect we may have some more filter in the next few minutes. And for that reason, we have opted to use a webinar format for today's webinar. That means that your main line of communication with us is the Q&A tool down at the bottom. There are many folks here today, and so what we encourage you to do is keep an eye on the questions that are being put into that QA tool, and then you can upvote questions, and we will prioritize those that have been upvoted. So we will first have a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll begin answering your questions. If you have questions that are about the other SMA requirements, so the 3 to 6 units, please save those for the SMA webinars. We only have until 3:15 today, so today is really focused on secondary suites and accessory dwelling units. And on that note, Avery, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is the third in a series of information webinars for local governments. If you're on this call, it's likely because you work for or with local government and have a role to play in implementing the legislative changes related to small-scale multi-unit housing. So the goal of the webinar today is to help local governments understand the legislative changes related to small-scale multi-unit housing, and more specifically as they relate to secondary suites and accessory dwelling units. So today we'll cover an overview of the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation and requirements, the policy direction for secondary suites and accessory dwelling units, the site standards package for lots permitting a secondary suite or an ADU, and some other considerations for local governments that are specific to these requirements. So as of December 7th, 2023, when Bill 44, the Housing Statutes Residential Development Bill, oh, actually that should be, yes, that's the correct date, came into force by regulation, all municipalities and regional districts in the province became subject to the requirements in this legislation. So these legislative changes require local governments to permit a minimum of 2 to 6 units of small-scale multi-unit housing in zones currently restricted to single-family use, and in some cases, duplex dwellings. And these are referred to as restricted zones in the legislation. So updated zoning bylaws must permit the minimum use and density without the need for the applicant to rezone. To support local governments in complying with these new requirements, a policy manual with site standards has been released that sets out provincial expectations for local governments in amending their zoning bylaws. And this presentation provides a high-level summary of many, but certainly not all of the contents of that policy manual and site standards. And we'll make sure you get a link to that in the chat later in the case that you haven't yet reviewed it. Next slide. So local governments must update their zoning bylaws by June 30th, 2024 to permit small-scale multi-unit housing in single-family and, where applicable, duplex zones. In doing so, local governments must consider the policy manual and site standards and any additional technical guidance that's issued by the province. Local governments must not use their authorities in such a way that unreasonably prohibits or restricts the use or density of use required to be permitted under the legislation. And local governments may request extensions for specific areas or lots within their jurisdiction, and we'll talk more about that in later slides. And now I'll hand it over to Matt to give a summary of the legislated requirements.
Okay, so this next section provides more details about the requirements for SMUD density, such as the minimum number of units that must be permitted, exemptions, and extensions. We're only going to talk about where the secondary suites and ADUs must be permitted today, but we encourage your participation in tomorrow's webinar where we'll discuss the higher density requirements as well. We'll also touch on a few important things local governments are not permitted to do when amending their zone bylaws and coming into compliance with Bill 44. Next slide. The legislative changes allow a minimum of 2 to 6 units of small-scale multi-unit housing in zones currently restricted to single-family and duplex dwellings. The table on the screen shows the number of units that are to be allowed. We'll talk about all of these in more detail shortly. At a high level, the requirements for secondary suites and ADUs apply very broadly across all local governments in the province. The requirements for a minimum of 3 to 6 units apply in more specific scenarios, and there are more exemptions for those requirements. After determining which of their zones are subject to the Bill 44 requirements, local governments will have to determine which lots are subject to the different density requirements set out in the legislation. Many lots, and in some cases, entire jurisdictions will not be subject to the requirements for 3 to 6 units. Generally speaking, although there are exceptions, only secondary suites or ADUs will be required in most regional district electoral areas, areas outside of urban containment boundaries, and municipalities with a population of less than 5,000. For these lots, local governments have several options for permitting secondary suites or ADUs, as noted on the screen. They may permit only one of the two, both, either or permit landowners to choose. For secondary suites and accessory dwelling units, restricted zones are those zones that otherwise would be restricted to detached single-family homes. We'll talk more about exempted lots shortly, but first a bit of additional information on where the 3 to 6 unit requirements do apply to provide some context. The 3 to 6 unit density only applies to single-family and duplex zone lots if the lot is inside an urban containment boundary established by either an OCP or regional growth strategy. Where there isn't an urban containment boundary, communities that have a population greater than 5,000. The lot has both water and sewer provided by a local government as a service. The lot is smaller than 4,050 meters squared. The minimum lot size of the zone for the purposes of subdivision is less than 4,050 meters squared, and the property has already been designated for heritage protection. If the 3 to 6 unit density doesn't apply and a property's zoning is limited to detached single-family homes, then either a secondary suite or accessory dwelling unit must be allowed. Next, we're going to touch on some exemptions. The requirement to permit secondary suites or ADUs does not apply to lands subject to rural land use bylaw or to the island's trust area. The only other exemption that applies for these secondary suite ADU requirements is that local governments can make are around hazardous conditions. If lands are subject to hazardous conditions, they can be exempt providing the local government has obtained a report from a qualified professional that certifies that increasing the density would increase the threat or risk from the hazardous condition, and the threat or risk cannot be practically mitigated. For hazardous conditions that can be mitigated, local governments can continue to use development permit areas, and we'll discuss that more on a later slide. The process for exempting lots with hazardous conditions is simply one of identification and notification. Local governments do not have to apply to exempt lots. Once local governments have identified where exemptions apply and they have amended their zoning bylaw to comply with the legislation, they must provide written notice to the Minister of Housing, which identifies the land to which the exemption applies and the section or sections of the legislation or regulation relevant to the purpose of the exemption. Local governments may also apply for extensions to comply with the SMUD legislation for areas within their jurisdiction. An application for an extension must be made by June 1st, 2024 for infrastructure-related extensions or June 30th, 2024 for an extraordinary circumstances extension. An extraordinary circumstance is a situation that will result in a sufficient diversion of local government resources such that compliance with the legislation in the specified timeline would not be possible. Examples of extraordinary circumstances may include major wildfire or flood events. Extensions may be granted by the minister which extend the compliance deadline until December 31st, 2030. The ministry will be issuing a policy bulletin with more detailed information on extensions and an application form in the coming weeks. This slide provides a recap on some of the local government responsibilities related to Bill 44. Local governments must update their zoning bylaws by June 30th, 2024 to enable the required densities under Bill 44. In doing so, they are not permitted to hold a public hearing on a zoning bylaw or amendments to a zoning bylaw proposed for the sole purpose of complying with the SMA legislation. We anticipate that some local governments may update zoning bylaws in phases or have several zoning bylaws that are updated at different times. All must be completed by June 30th, 2024 for all areas in their jurisdiction, except for those to which an extension has been granted by the minister. The legislation is explicit in indicating that local governments must not use their authorities in such a way that unreasonably prohibits or restricts the use or density of use required to be permitted under SMA. There are several examples included on this slide. Back to Avery.
Thanks. So this part of the presentation identifies factors local governments must consider when updating their zoning bylaws to be compliant with the small-scale multi-unit housing requirements and sets provincial expectations for compliance. This corresponds with part 2 of the policy manual, which discusses considerations for zoning bylaw updates. We know it's typically not a single zoning rule that impacts the viability of a small-scale multi-unit housing project, but rather the cumulative and cross-cutting impacts of several regulations combined. This section highlights some of those interdependencies and trade-offs and provides guidance for creating a suite of zoning requirements to help enable the viability of these more diverse forms of housing. So zoning bylaws typically regulate the density and intensity of development in residential zones by controlling the number of units per lot or units per hectare, and through limits like floor area ratios or floor space ratios. The small-scale multi-unit housing legislation will supersede local government's ability to regulate on-parcel density where the legislation applies through the introduction of a minimum number of required housing units to be allowed for lots of varying characteristics. The policy manual recommends alternative approaches of regulating building footprint sizes, heights, and the number of units to achieve the same outcome and limits on building intensity. Next, we're going to talk about setbacks. So setbacks for buildings and structures serve several functions. They're often designed to create a consistent look and feel on a street, mitigate concerns about adjacent uses, and define where open space on a parcel is to be located. However, they can also restrict opportunities to work around on-site geotechnical or environmental constraints and limit design flexibility and even diversity in terms of housing forms. Reductions in setbacks, particularly rear and side yard setbacks, may be required to accommodate an increased number of housing units on what have traditionally been single-family residential lots. To create a favorable development environment that encourages landowners to add additional housing units on their lots, local governments should adopt modest lot line setbacks in restricted zones. This will help ensure the viability of small-scale multi-unit housing forms and provide flexibility for the development of new units through multiple configurations. It's important to note that the BC Building Code also establishes spatial separation requirements from lot lines and between buildings to prevent the spread of fire, and that front yard setbacks should be designed to account for any future infrastructure needs, for example, to allow sufficient room for planned sidewalks. In terms of building height regulations in single-family and duplex zones often permit up to a 2-story building with a height between 7 and 8 meters. The small-scale multi-unit housing policy manual recommends allowing a height of at least 3 stories in restricted zones and at least 8 meters for accessory dwelling units. The secondary suite can easily be accommodated in a 3-story home, and allowing a height of 8 meters allows for an accessory dwelling unit over a garage. And variations, we understand, may be required to account for sloped sites. In most single-family zones, lot coverages range between 25 and 40%, although it can be set below that on larger lots to control house size, or higher on smaller lots where a low lot coverage could impede development or a livable home. For lots on which only secondary suites and/or ADUs must be permitted, the policy manual recommends lot coverage of 30%. For larger size lots, local governments are encouraged to set lower lot coverage limits to discourage unnecessarily large and costly homes. And parking. So commonly local governments require 1 or 2 parking spots on single family lots, but maintaining these parking ratios on a per unit basis for new homes developed as a result of small scale multi-unit housing requirements may not be desirable due to the large number of trade-offs. For lots to which the secondary suites or accessory dwelling units apply, the site standards package in the policy manual recommends no on-site parking requirements, rather allowing the landowner or the builder to decide what's appropriate based on local market demand and site conditions. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the section in the policy manual called site standards. The site standards which are recommended for lots where a secondary suite or ADU must be allowed. We'll discuss what they are, their purpose, and how to use them. So the site standard packages set provincial expectations for how local governments in their zoning bylaws will enable financially viable small-scale multi-unit housing developments by providing flexibility for builders and developers. Local governments may need to make changes to the recommendations based on local conditions. This is guidance that local governments have to consider when they're amending their zoning bylaws under the legislation. So all site standard packages are designed to ensure alignment with the requirements of the legislation and additionally provide recommendations for zoning bylaw regulations for which local governments retain discretion. The recommended zoning bylaw parameters are based on best and emerging practices where possible, experiences and outcomes from other jurisdictions, and the objectives of the legislation to enable more diverse and affordable housing forms. Policy Site Standard Package A applies to lots where the requirements for secondary suite and ADUs apply. So consistent with the more rural or semi-rural characteristics of these locations, the setbacks are larger and the lot coverage limits are lower than the other site standard packages. A height of 3 stories is recommended to be allowed for the principal dwelling height, and a height of 2 stories for ADUs to enable suites over garages as mentioned. And the recommended approach for parking on these lots, as we said, is 1 space per dwelling unit or not having any requirements. And now I'll pass it over to Matt, who's going to talk a bit about some other considerations.
Awesome. So this final section of the presentation touches on some other considerations for local governments as they work to bring their zoning bylaw and other regulations into compliance with Bill 44 that are especially relevant to the requirements around secondary suites and ADUs. In tomorrow's longer webinar, we'll discuss some of the practical guidance included in the policy manual that local governments can use to move towards compliance. Starting with the BC Building Code. Historically, the BC Building Code limited the size of secondary suites. For this reason, the definition of a secondary suite in many zoning bylaws is the same as what it was in the Building Code, a dwelling unit having a total floor space of not more than 90 meters squared or having less than 40% of the habitable space of the building. These prescribed floor space amounts were removed from the Building Code in 2019. We would encourage local governments to also amend their bylaws to remove these previous code references. Please note that the code does not require the owner to occupy either of these units, but the 2 units must be a single real estate entity. In other words, a secondary suite cannot be strata titled. Additionally, secondary suites are now allowed in a wider range of building types, including side-by-side duplexes and row houses. Moving on to some discussion regarding small-scale multi-unit housing, the ALR, and secondary suites and ADUs. Most properties in the ALR are zoned agricultural, and the Agricultural Land Commission Act is paramount to most legislation, including the Local Government Act. However, the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation does apply to properties in the ALR which are zoned for single-family use, and the Agricultural Land Reserve Regulation does allow secondary suites in principal dwelling units and 1 accessory dwelling unit, subject to certain conditions. All single-family zones are expected to allow either 1 secondary suite or 1 accessory dwelling unit, even if the property is within the ALR. As many properties in agricultural areas rely on septic systems and/or potable water sources like wells, we expect the preferred option will be secondary suites. When amending single-family zones which apply to properties in the ALR, it is important to know the specifics of what is permitted by the ALR use regulation. More information can be found on the Agricultural Land Commission's website. As part of updating their zoning bylaws, local governments should consider how the requirements of other provincial legislation and regulations can be met. As a secondary suite and ADU provisions of the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation applies to areas not served by local government water and sewer, the Drinking Water Protection Act and the Sewerage System Regulation under the Public Health Act are of particular interest. Single-family residences containing a secondary suite may be considered exempt from the permitting requirements of the Drinking Water Protection Act. This is not the case where a well or other private water source serves a single-family dwelling and a detached accessory dwelling unit that are on the same lot. Having a single-family dwelling and ADU on the same lot meets the Drinking Water Protection Act's definition of a water system, and it must be designed, permitted, and operated in accordance with the Act. For lots not serviced by a local government sewer system, local government should only permit secondary suites, not ADUs, to mitigate risks related to groundwater contamination. Development permit areas are a tool available to establish development conditions. They are typically designated through OCPs and sometimes specified in zoning bylaws. Local governments may continue to use them, provided they do not unreasonably restrict the ability to use land at the use or density prescribed by SMA. The policy manual has 5 pages, starting on page 46, of guidance on appropriate use of various DPAs in the context of Bill 44, which we'll spend a bit more time on tomorrow. From a process standpoint, following adoption of zoning bylaws to enable SMA, local governments should review their DPAs and associated guidelines to ensure they do not unreasonably discourage or restrict SMA development. And also, as a general practice, ensure they are using the correct tool for the job. For example, development permits should not be used to require a business license rather than using a business license bylaw. A final consideration is regarding heritage conservation and small-scale multi-unit housing. For the 3 to 6 units, parcels of land that already have a heritage designation under Section 611 of the Local Government Act or are protected under Section 12.1 Sub 2 of the Heritage Conservation Act are exempt from zoning updates otherwise required under the SMA legislation. This exemption does not apply to the small-scale multi-unit housing requirements for secondary suites and accessory dwelling units. All archaeological sites, recorded and unrecorded, are granted automatic protection through Section 12.1 of the Heritage Conservation Act. Local governments may update zoning regulations to comply with the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation on land with recorded or unrecorded archaeological sites, and the Heritage Conservation Act permitting procedures must be followed. Local governments are not to use Section 611 of the Local Government Act for designated heritage conservation areas with the intention of exempting areas of their jurisdiction from the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation. Once this slide deck is posted on our website, this slide includes links to numerous resources related to small-scale multi-unit housing, such as the policy manual and site standards, other presentation, and websites with further information. I think that wraps up our presentation for today, and I'll pass it back to Rebecca Pence to moderate our Q&A session.
Thanks, Matthew and Avery. So we now have about 50 minutes to take questions, and I can see they're starting to trickle into the Q&A. So please take a look before you enter any more and see if your question's already in there, and you can upvote it. Again, just a reminder, please focus your questions on the secondary suite ADU requirements as opposed to other SMA requirements. And with that, I think I will dive in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the questions based on those with the highest upvotes, and then I'll refer to our panelists to respond. So the first question, which Avery, I'll start with you, would be around the form and character requirements for DPAs. The policy manual suggests that they are discouraged from being applied to SMA developments up to 6 units in all but exceptional circumstances. And what would an exceptional circumstance for form and character be?
I'm going to avoid providing legal advice there, but this is essentially like this is policy guidance that local governments need to consider. The legislation prohibits or restricts local government from restricting or unreasonably prohibiting or restricting small-scale multi-unit housing. We know that form and character development permit areas can make it a lot harder to develop this type of housing, and so they're strongly discouraged.
Great. All right, next question. And I think this one will also, I would suspect most of these will be going your way, Avery. Are bare land strata lots entitled to a secondary suite and/or ADU?
Yeah, so for bare land stratas, small-scale multi-unit housing requirements apply to all restricted zones regardless of the type of subdivision that created the parcels in the zone. That said, strata corporations may have or may make bylaws regarding the use and enjoyment of strata lots. So it depends what's allowed at the moment, and then strata corporations retain their authorities to make bylaws.
Great, and I think I can answer the next one. What date will the webinar recordings be available on the ministry website? And appreciate that the website's been posted in the question. We endeavor to get them up within a week. There's actually quite an involved process of downloading, getting it onto YouTube, and posting it on the web page. So we're endeavoring to get them up within a week. So we should have it up hopefully by next Tuesday. Next question. What about building schemes not allowing secondary suites and/or ADUs? Do they take precedence? Is this statement accurate? Building schemes takes precedence. No restrictions, not outlawed, not encouraged. Avery?
Yeah, so if I understand what you're talking about, the legislation doesn't prohibit statutory building schemes, so they can continue to be used.
Thanks, Avery. And I'll just bring your attention to the chat. We have posted the series of resources that were in the last slide into the chat, so you can pull those out of there. All right, next question. Would charging DCCs on secondary suites be restricted? So we'll pass along that DCCs aren't payable on development that contain fewer than 4 self-contained units. However, you can choose to charge DCCs on these types of development if you provide for it in your DCC bylaw. All right, and then a question around why secondary suites and ADUs are being separately defined. Can you explain, Avery, why these types of units are still being explicitly defined in the context of single-family housing?
So I think the way that the legislation is set up is essentially to require, higher density being allowed on single family and duplex lots, essentially in urban areas and where local governments have already determined they want growth to happen. And then outside of those areas, outside urban containment boundaries and in smaller communities, the intention is to have secondary suites or an ADU allowed on single family lots in those broader areas. And we know that the majority of local governments already allow secondary suites or ADUs in single family zones in many cases. So yeah, just making it explicit that across the province in single family zones outside of those denser urban areas, secondary suites or ADUs should be allowed.
Great. All right, next question. For your alternative approach, can setbacks be used to ensure adequate off-street parking?
So in most of the policy packages, very little parking is recommended to be allowed. We know that parking is probably the biggest thing that will impact the viability of small-scale multi-unit housing at higher densities. Given today we're only really talking about secondary suites and ADUs, the recommendation in the policy package is to allow, I think, 1 unit or 1 parking spot. If that has to be accommodated through setbacks, that's a choice that local governments are able to make in their zoning bylaw.
And another question on setbacks, have fire suppression considerations been contemplated as part of the minimum setbacks? And this is a bigger deal in areas with limited fire services.
Yeah, they have, and the BC Building Code prevails. So I think, when we say local governments need to consider local conditions, that might be one of the things that needs to be considered.
And if a property has a restrictive covenant to not permit a secondary dwelling unit, coach house, does the legislation override restrictive covenants that limit additional housing?
It does not. The legislation doesn't override covenants, and it isn't on our radar as something that limits development.
All right, and for this next question, Avery, I think you touched on this. This question may have come in before the slide on ALR, but which legislation would have paramountcy in the ALR? Sorry, my screen just jumped down to the bottom. Bill 44 conflicts with the local government's ability to regulate residential uses in the ALC regs. And we have an agricultural zone that does not include single family development as a permitted use, single family dwelling as a permitted use.
Right. So first, the legislation only applies to zones where use is limited to single family residential dwellings, or in some cases, duplex dwellings. So if that's not even a permitted use, it probably wouldn't fall into a restricted zone. That said, in implementing the legislation, we're expecting local governments where the legislation, where zones fall into the definition of a restricted zone, and they're in the ALR, to amend their zoning bylaws in keeping with what's permitted in the ALR use regulation. So for most zoning bylaws, all single family zones will need to allow either one secondary suite or one accessory dwelling unit, even if the property is in the ALR. Yeah, and so knowing that a lot of these properties will have well water, septic systems, we expect the preferred option will be secondary suites.
Okay, and does the new legislation restrict the ability of local governments and regional districts to regulate the tenure of accessory dwelling units?
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Does the new legislation restrict the ability of local governments to regulate the tenure of accessory dwelling units? For example, some regional districts limit accessory dwelling units to rental only in their zoning bylaws.
The legislation does not address the tenure of units.
Right. And have the school boards been informed of the potential impacts on their school catchment with the addition of more units?
The relationship with school boards is between school boards and the Ministry of Education. We've worked with the Ministry of Education, probably I'm not the expert to provide a good answer on that one.
Yeah, just to say that there has been lots of consultation, and these changes won't happen overnight. There's going to be some planning that will support this work as well.
Thanks.
Okay, and then I understand you were going to, sorry, the screen just pops down when something gets outvoted as the top votes. I understand you were going out to industry to get designs for accessory dwelling units that could be pre-approved. How is this moving along, and when will we see these?
Oh, that is in another part of the ministry, but I know that the contract for pre-approved designs went to RFP and it's recently closed. So I understand that that process is moving along, and we look forward to seeing what they look like as well.
And then are there recommendations on how to deal with applications between now and when zoning bylaws are to be amended by?
There's no legislation doesn't have, or regulations doesn't have anything about in-stream applications, but the policy manual does suggest that local governments come up with a consistent policy for how they're going to deal with in-stream applications between now and the compliance period. So, you know, a choice of whether or not you want to consider how your zoning bylaw is going to have to change or defer. But either way, the recommendation, you know, the guidance is to come up with a consistent policy and apply it fairly.
Right. Okay, and will building code provide for alternative standards for suite conversions, both within a dwelling and within an accessory building?
Don't believe any changes to the building code in relation to secondary suites are being contemplated.
All right. And then does this apply to bare land strata lots or just fee simple?
Yeah, I think we talked about bare land strata already, but the bare land strata, the small scale multi-unit housing requirements apply to all restricted zones, regardless of the type of subdivision that created the parcel. But strata corporations still have the authority to make or to have or make bylaws regarding the use and enjoyment of strata lots.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is, do you have an estimate on when the LGA online will be updated to include amendments from the recent housing bills? It is much more convenient to review these guidelines in one location. I'm not sure if LGA online, who actually is the lead on that, so we might have to circle back and find out when that will be updated. For now, though, the intent is to post all of the guidance materials on our webpage, and that's where we encourage everybody to go to look for the policy guidance, the webinars, all of that kind of information is all being stored in that one place. All right, next question. Many residence property owners have multiple suites in single family dwellings for the past 20 years. Is the province going to amend the BC building code to allow for 2 suites in a single family dwelling as they already exist, and local governments have a hard time enforcing the bylaws as most end up in the courts? Nowadays, property owners are renting 1 suite and the second suite is being occupied by family members. Please advise. I don't know if you're able to respond to that, Avery. That seems like that might be something to be contemplated in the future.
Yeah, as to my knowledge, changes to the BC building code in relation to secondary suites are not currently being contemplated.
Yeah. All right, and we have some commercial and industrial zones that permit a single family dwelling as an accessory use. Would these be considered restricted zones?
So restricted zones are zones that are restricted to single family dwellings that, you know, for the 3 to 6 unit densities could already include a secondary suite or an ADU. And for the 3 to 6 unit requirements, it also applies to zones where the use is restricted to duplex use. So yeah, that's the definition of a restricted zone. I don't want to give like legal advice on a specific zone based on a question in the chat, but to say that the definition of restricted zones are those, you know, restricted only to single family or duplex dwellings.
Yeah. And then we have a follow-up question on building schemes and the ability to use them to prohibit suites.
Yeah, I think buildings, as I understand, building schemes can still be registered.
Okay. And then will there be any regulations to limit the size or floor area of secondary suites or accessory dwelling units?
No, so well, like local governments can amend their zoning bylaws as long as they consider, like it at their discretion, as long as they consider the policy guidance in the manual. And so the site standards package A for secondary suites and ADUs provides some guidance there around what we think should work.
Right. All right, and will the province be preparing a Q&A summary from this webinar? What we're planning on doing is posting the presentation and the recording, and we also have some frequently asked questions being prepared, but we're not going to have specific Q&As in response to these. But people can go back and listen to the recording, and they can check the FAQs as well. But I will say that really the main source for information for folks who have to do the work on the ground to implement these changes is the policy manual, and I highly encourage you to go through and review that in detail as you look to adopting the requirements. All right, next question. So would density within a floodplain be restricted to a single detached dwelling or single detached dwelling with an ADU if proven hazardous?
Yeah, so I'll try my best. Essentially, like I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but in a floodplain, local governments can still use development permit areas and floodplain bylaws to address hazardous conditions.
Right. And then another question on floodplains. In floodplains with FCLs, and I'm not sure what that stands for, how do you ensure that new built suites or retrofits are built above FCL? Is it allowable for a municipality to permit suites but maintain minimum elevations as set out in a development permit area or floodplain management bylaw?
Yeah, and so hopefully my previous answer answers that one, that they can still use DPAs and floodplain bylaws.
Right. And for clarity, does the density requirement apply to zones or to parcels of a specific size, i.e. a parcel of a hectare or more pre-zoned single family?
I'm going to take a guess at what they mean, but for specific to the requirements for secondary suites and ADUs, there's no limit on lot size. There is some guidance in the manual around allowing either a secondary suite or an ADU depending on lot size though.
Okay. And I think you've answered this question, but maybe just for clarity, when local government has a size restriction on detached suites, is that still valid?
Yeah, there's nothing, I think we covered that in one of the slides. There's no longer, in the building code, there's no longer a size limit on suites. There was once, but there's not anymore. I believe it was taken out in 2019. So it's, local governments could still choose to have that in there, but they may want to remove it to, just make rules as flexible as possible to encourage development.
And will there be regulations to require that single family dwellings and accessory dwelling units be a single real estate entity?
I believe they already are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where there are existing unserviced lots well under 1 hectare, will zoning have to be changed to allow a secondary suite, even if on-site servicing likely can't be accommodated? For example, our regional district allows suites in all houses except where the lot is under 1/2 hectare and has on-site servicing only.
Maybe we can come back to that one.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's leave that one up so we can come back to it.
I just want to make sure I'm giving the right answer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So is it correct that the province only allows suites on parcels less than 1 hectare, but not accessory dwelling units? The only difference between the two appears to be a shared wall.
So it's not that we don't allow it. That's just the guidance based on existing drinking water policy. So local governments need to consider the conditions in their own communities.
Okay. And can munis still restrict mobile homes, prefabs, etc., from being utilized as accessory dwelling units?
Okay, one sec. Can you repeat that one? I'm having a hard time keeping them at the top of my screen as well. And I need to read. I'm a better reader than I am a listener.
All good. The question is around whether mobile homes and prefabs, whether municipalities can restrict those from being used as accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in the legislation or the regulations that would prevent them from doing that.
Okay. All right. And if you have an applicant develop a fourplex on a single family lot under the new legislation, can they also have an additional suite associated with these units?
So I think if a local government, if the unit falls into a zone where the local government must permit up to 4 units, then anything above that 4 units is like additional units that the local government would have to permit, right? We're saying that only up to 4 units has to be allowed. So how those 4 units are configured, the recommendation in the policy manual is that you allow as much flexibility as possible, so to allow that to be a fourplex or a duplex with 2 secondary suites, or a triplex with an ADU, like a garden suite in the backyard. But it doesn't require that you allow a fourplex that plus secondary suites. Like you can get to the 4 units any way you want, and you don't have to allow anything above 4 units. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yep, that was great. Thanks, Avery. All right. Can local governments allow detached accessory dwelling units on lots smaller than 1 hectare with both on-site water and sewer?
Yeah, so the guidance around allowing ADUs versus secondary suites on lots depending on lot size is guidance based on like the Ministry of Health's drinking water policy. And if there's other conditions in place that make more flexibility like possible on that lot, then that's totally within a local government's discretion to zone around.
All right, it's mentioned several times that local governments have to consider the guidelines and legislation from the province. What if we consider it and decide to not proceed as recommended?
Then that's a legal risk, I guess, that the local government will bear. So if in theory, then a property owner that wants to develop their property in a way that would align with the legislation could challenge your bylaw.
All right. Are there exemptions for lots with known archaeological sites, such as wildlife or archaeological sites, wildlife, or fish-bearing streams, where these features minimize the developable area of a lot?
So I think we spoke to known archaeological sites in a previous slide. And there aren't exemptions for other features, although they may be elements of development permit areas.
Okay, great. There's a question on monitoring and evaluation implementation of the new municipal zoning bylaws to support housing creation. Will lessons learned from various BC municipalities be shared by the province? So I'll speak to a couple of things, and then Avery, if you have anything to add to that. And we do want to focus today around secondary suites, so I don't want to take too much time on this. But we have provided funding to PIBC to support a peer learning network, and I hope that that will be an opportunity for local governments to share, their lessons learned, best practices, and so on and so forth. So you should be hearing more about that program coming soon. Obviously, we will have monitoring and evaluation programs in this, and provincial government regularly reports back on their metrics as part of the service plan. So yes, we will be reporting back on that and sharing out information on the program rollout. Avery, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so the next question about the building code does not protect adjacent existing units in regards to fire protection. So we did touch on this already. Can setbacks and size restrictions be used to ensure fire underwriters' survey requirements are met for fire protection instead of building code?
Yeah, and I think what I've been saying stands is that we've provided some recommendations and policy that you have to consider, but the expectation is that local governments will take local conditions into account when they're preparing their zoning bylaw amendments.
Right.
So maybe we can go back up to that question from Dana. So where there's existing unserviced lots under 1 hectare, will zoning have to be changed to allow a secondary suite unit on serve? Right. So I think the answer is the same as the answer I just gave, right? Is that that recommendation is oh wait, let me think about this for a second. No, I'll have to think about that one. I have to get back to you on that one. Dana, can you put which local government you're from or your email address in the chat maybe?
They can't.
Okay.
But we'll maybe host, can you pop into the chat our Plum email address and they can send us an email?
Send us that question. So I'm having a hard time thinking on my feet for that one.
You've been thinking very well on your feet, Avery. All right, so moving on, could you please provide some examples of what a hazardous exemption may be?
Yeah, I hesitate to give examples that could then be construed as legal advice to say like, yes, that hazardous condition definitely meets the exemption requirements. But what the regulation says is that if you have a hazardous condition that it can't practically be mitigated against, and that increasing density in that area is going to increase that risk, it's just not a good idea. And you already have, or you can get a report from a qualified professional that says, this development is inappropriate in this area, then those lots can be exempted.
All right, I think the next one may be a recommendation rather than a question. The risk of subdivision comes in with new buildings where a strata plan can be submitted directly to the LTSA. So please adopt legislation to prohibit that. There is nothing an LG can do to prevent this unless they register a no subdivision covenant on title. All right, and then the next question, where is the regulation that requires that a single family dwelling and an accessory dwelling unit located on a lot must be a single real estate entity? In other words, where is the regulation that prohibits these dwellings from being stratified?
Yeah, so that's one we might need to follow up on as well. I'm not the strata Property Act expert, and I think you're right. It might have more to do with minimum lot size for subdivision. So at risk of saying, giving incorrect information, if you want to submit your question to the Plum inbox, it might be easier for us to answer that way, and then we can include the answer in an FAQ in the future as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right. local governments of less than 5,000 are encouraged but not required to adhere to these regulations. Is this correct? Great time to clarify, Avery.
No, no, all local governments are captured in the legislation. And so if you are in a municipality or a local government with a population under 5,000, and you're not, you don't have any part of your community inside an urban containment boundary that's set out in a regional growth strategy, then the requirement is that you allow either a secondary suite or an ADU, or if you want to allow both, you can, etc., in zones that are restricted to single family homes.
Right. Okay, our municipality has allowed detached secondary suites since 2017. We have regulations around floor space setbacks from principal dwellings, as well as distances from side and front lot lines. Can we keep those regulations if they are consistent with government regulations? Is there any policy direction on setbacks of ADUs from principal dwellings?
So starting first, I don't think there is guidance or a recommendation on setbacks of ADUs from principal dwellings. And then in terms of can you keep your existing regulations, I think it depends on, like, you can, the simple answer is yes, you can keep your existing regulations. If your single family zones that allow ADUs are captured by the higher density requirements, you'll likely still have to make zoning bylaw amendments to allow for those more units. If you're only being captured by the requirements for secondary suites or ADUs, like if you've only got single family zones where the 3 to 6 unit requirements don't apply, the definition of a restricted zone in that case is a zone that's currently restricted to single family dwellings only. So if you already allow an ADU, you're actually not captured by the legislation. So it really depends where you are and how you're being captured by the legislation. And then I think the province, where local governments already have regulations or policies around small scale multi-unit housing, we certainly encourage local governments to take a look at the policy manual and the site standards that we've recommended and see if there's any way that they can or any need to align their regulations and policies with the provincial approach to provide maximum flexibility on site for development and to provide a consistent development sort of landscape across the province.
Great. All right, so now this question relates to servicing. So whether the servicing is public or septic, what difference does it make if it is zoned for single family? Septic is based on bedrooms, not dwelling units. There are many small pioneer homes in our area that are well below the allowable FAR. If you can prove the system design works to the health authority, then let's take local government. Sorry, this keeps my questions keep jumping around here a little bit. Let's take local government out of the discussion. The same applies to whether an accessory dwelling unit or internal suite is permitted. Total floor area and coverage should be the only consideration for local government. So this seems a little less of a question here and more just a commentary on the servicing requirements. Anything to add to that, Avery?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine.
Okay. The next one is another comment about debating who is the best regional district planner, and at least people aren't self-promoting, but we can probably move on from that one. Will Bill 44 prohibit the construction of the single family dwelling on a parcel?
Nope, absolutely not. So just a minimum number of units that have to be permitted on a single family lot. So you have to, if the if the requirement is to allow a single family home and allow a secondary suite or an ADU, and someone chooses to build a single family home without a secondary suite or an ADU, that's fine.
Great. And we have another question about the term consider in terms of the policy manual. I mean, I do think you've covered this. Is there anything else you want to add around how local government should be considering the policy guidance?
Yeah, so the legislation requires that you consider the policy manual when amending your zoning bylaw and that you're not unreasonably restricting or prohibiting this type of development. And so the sort of final arbiter of whether or not that would be true would be the courts in the case of someone seeking a judicial review of your zoning bylaw amendment.
Great. All right, regarding the ability to restrict SMUD density due to hazards and the inability to mitigate such risks, is this specifically outlined in the legislation or only present in the policy manual?
It's in the regulation. It's in the associated regulation as well as the policy.
Yeah. And the regulations are posted on our webpage if you're interested in reviewing that. So many zones include caretaker units. Similar to the last question of where a zone includes single family dwelling as an accessory use, we are assuming these are not the target of Bill 44, but rather residential zones. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, and then how does the province intend to ensure local governments are held accountable for addressing the housing crisis that communities are facing? Maybe I'll just speak very quickly to, there's a variety of tools that the province has undertaken to ensure that local governments are doing everything they can to speed up approvals and get new housing built. And they range that the Housing Supply Act sets housing targets for municipalities that they have 5 years to achieve. And then this new legislation, I would say, puts a lot of requirements on local governments to update the planning framework. Avery, do you want to add anything to that?
No, other than to say, like, we've done our best to balance, the desire from government to enable this type of development with the desires from local government to have some authority over their own community planning, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right. So we have another question on a single real estate entity. I'm thinking that would also be another one that we might want to have submitted by email. It's a question about stratification of duplex entities.
Yeah, and so I can try here, but essentially, like as I understand it, duplexes, the BC Building Code allows secondary suites in duplex units. So each duplex unit could have a secondary suite. Duplexes can be strata titled. So like each duplex with a secondary suite would be a single real estate entity, like each side of the duplex, or if it were stacked. But each duplex unit with its associated secondary suite would be a single real estate entity.
Great.
Hopefully that
helps. And if there are additional questions coming out of that, please email the address in the chat.
Mm-hmm. And I think like my brain is actually starting to, the necessary wheel started turning. So for ADUs can be strata titled, but it depends on the minimum lot size for subdivision there. So there's nothing in the legislation that prevents or enables the stratification or the tenure or ownership of units. It's this legislation really just addresses unit level density that need to be permitted on lots.
Great.
Hopefully that's helpful.
All right, the next question is on heritage. Is there a difference in the application of legislation between heritage designation, heritage registry, heritage inventories? Most heritage lots are in an inventory and not a registered designation.
Yeah, there is a difference. So the only exemptions for heritage are those with existing heritage designation, and there's two different ways they can be designated. I would have to refer back to legislation to give the detailed answer. But going forward, you know, heritage lots that are just in an inventory and don't yet have a heritage designation could still receive a heritage designation, but they'll still have to allow the density required by the legislation.
Okay. Another question on lots, for lots that are on septic not connected to municipal sewer system, are ADUs prohibited or just discouraged?
Yeah, it's not a prohibition, just discouraged.
Great. Okay, so next question. Even the most simple accessory dwelling unit or accessory dwelling unit requires a new home registration form with HPO. Due to a very limited pool of licensed builders, this is a hurdle we often see as a local government. Is there a possibility of relaxing these HPO requirements for these very simple buildings if they are under a certain size? I also thought it was strange that the owner of a property had to occupy the garden suite for 1 year when asking HPO seems difficult to manage with a larger family.
Yeah, we can certainly take that advice into consideration. And I don't know if Leslie knows anything about the owner. I think whether or not a garden suite needs to be occupied by an owner is not necessarily determined by HPO, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have anything to add to this one. And I hadn't heard about that last component, but can touch base with BC Housing for more info.
So again, if you want to submit the question to our Plum inbox, then we can direct it in the right way. All right, so does the requirement to allow secondary suites apply to all zones that permit a single family dwelling, regardless if the zone is a rural, commercial, or agricultural zone?
No. So the requirements in the legislation only apply to zones that are where the use is restricted to single family use.
Yeah. I think some of these questions probably came in earlier too, and so they've been answered, but so we're covering old ground, but we'll do it quickly.
Maybe we can
we only
skip
have
over ones that we've answered.
We only have 5 minutes left, so why don't we take a quick look? I see there's a question around off-street parking. If developers decide not to provide off-street parking, will there be increased provisions for EV charging ports on local streets?
So the legislation or the policy manual doesn't provide any requirements or guidance around EV charging, and it suggests or recommends how many parking spots may want to be recommended or required for different density level requirements on lots with different characteristics. And the only place where parking is actually like where local governments can't require a parking minimum on site is where the 6 units must be required. So we can talk about that one a little bit more in depth tomorrow as well.
Okay, great. And then it looks like somebody's included a link to the BC Building Code for secondary suites for real estate entities. So, so you can access that. So there's a question around floodplains here and the exemption requirements. If in a known floodplain, typically you would prefer to limit density rather than increase density. Sorry, my screen just skipped over that one. Therefore, if the professional report identifies flooding hazard, the SMA requirements would likely be nullified, is my understanding. Is that interpretation correct?
I think it depends. It may still be something if the density can still be allowed, but there's mitigative measures that can be put in place. Then no, likely the requirements wouldn't be nullified, but you can still use development permit areas and floodplain bylaws to address those concerns.
Great. We have a question about joining tomorrow's SMA meeting, and we have links in the chat, so you should be able to host. If we don't have it already, can you please put in the link to the webinar page so people can sign up for tomorrow's SMA webinar as well. Avery, we only have 2 minutes left here. I'm wondering if you're seeing anything else that you think bears mentioning based on the outstanding questions.
I'll maybe just address Terry's statement or question around reducing the requirement to have owners living on site. Single family homes don't require owners to live on site. So those can be rental properties as well. And people are, at the moment can buy single family property or prior to the legislation coming into force could buy a single property and have it rezoned to higher density and rent it out. So I think the intention of the legislation is to increase the supply of housing and the diversity of housing forms that are available in those neighborhoods.
Okay, great.
And then we'll leave it there.
All right. Well, we're down to the last minute here. So I just want to take the time to, in particular, thank Avery and Matthew for delivering the presentation, and Avery for your quick responses to all the questions and for such great thinking on your feet. I know there may be some outstanding questions out there. We did try to do our best and get through as many as possible. If there's something that you still didn't quite get an answer to, you can reach out by email, and I definitely encourage you to attend the SMA webinars, because I think there's a fair bit of overlap between the secondary suites and some of the other 3 to 6 unit requirements. So you may get some additional questions answered. And we'll look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thank you very much.